I've done a bit of research. I did my dissertation in Mexico, Sierra Madre, and I did more research in the Peruvian Amazon, but I'm not going to talk about the region. I'd like to just bring up one comment that Ambassador Weeks made earlier today, that with all our expertise and the overlap of topics, that we might be able to have a really strong conversation today and get stronger as we go along, so maybe we can have a nice wrap-up session here with our great expertise here on this panel. I'll introduce Ambassador Langdale, who will make the keynote speech. And, Ambassador Langdale is, he served as U.S. Ambassador to Costa Rica from 2005 to 2008. During his tenure, he focused on the ratification of the Central America Free Trade Agreement. He also negotiated and finalized the largest debt for nature swap, an agreement with the United States, Costa Rica, the Nature Conservancy, and Conservation International. Previously, Ambassador Langdale served as president of Posadas USA, the U.S. subsidiary of Grupo Posadas, from 1989 until 2005. And as chair of the Texas Department of Economic Development from 1997 to 2001. More recently been involved in the George W. Bush Foundation that launched the George W. Bush Presidential Center. Our panelists, Dr. Tatiana Didier, research economist with the World Bank. She obtained a PhD in economics from MIT in 2008. She is published in the area of international economics and is currently doing research on international finance. She's co-editor of the forthcoming book, Emerging Issues in Financial Development, Lessons from Latin America. And our other panelist is Anne-Marie Schneider. She's director of the Canada Studies Center at Michigan State University. And, she is Associate Director for Program Planning and Policy Education at the Institute for Public Policy and Social Research. So with that, I will let Ambassador Langdale take the stage.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank all of you for staying here until the end to see the end of the Ambassador trifecta of speeches. The problem with being last is everything's already been said. So I think I'll just tell you a few kind of stories about my experience with globalization and finance and investment in primarily Latin America, and then turn it over to my colleagues to talk about it in more detail. My first exposure to foreign trade, if you will, was in 1989. I purchased a handful of motels along the Texas-Mexico border, McAllen and Laredo, Texas. And what that looked like at the time was a kind of a sleepy agricultural region, and a little bit of oil and gas and retail. In McAllen, the mall there, La Plaza Mall, was the #1 sales per square foot mall in the United States in the Simon Mall system, which is the largest mall operator in America. And so that was a little bit of a mind expander for me. In a little town like McAllen, the mall was outperforming any other mall in the United States. And in Laredo, when I would land at the airport, I would see lined up a string of DC-3 cargo planes pointed south, where they would load up electronics and fly them, smuggle them into Mexico to resell to the local consumer market. Because Mexico was a closed economy. It was the dead end of this kind of concept of autarky, where countries were taught that they needed to control their own destiny by controlling all of their means of production. They had to have their own automobile manufacturing system. They had to make their own shoes. They had to mine their own resources, and they had to be self-sufficient. And it was an economic model that really didn't work. You still see it a little bit in Brazil, but it's a very large country. but for the most part it had bankrupted Mexico. In the 1980s, Mexico, it's called the lost decade. 1982, the peso was devalued by President of Mexico. He famously said 2 days before he devalued the peso that he was going to defend it like a dog. And then 2 days later, after he had informed all his friends that he was getting ready to do it and they cashed out, he devalued the peso and sent the Mexican economy into a long twilight. I love my Mexican friends. They have a great sense of humor. And so when this former president would show his face on the street in Mexico in the 80s, that groups of Mexican citizens would gather around and start barking at him like a dog. And it got so bad that he had to leave the country, which is kind of a tradition for former presidents in Mexico. But in 1994, things started to change for Mexico with the ratification and implementation of the North American Free Trade Agreement. This was a sea change in the policy viewpoint of how to deal with Latin America. It was an idea that was hatched or first talked about by President Reagan. George H.W. Bush, our 41st president, negotiated the agreement, and Bill Clinton got it through Congress and signed it in 1993, and in January 1 of 1994 it was implemented. We're on its 20-year anniversary of its implementation. People don't think about it much now, but at the time I remember it was quite controversial and difficult to pass. And hats off to Bill Clinton for doing something that really was beyond the partisan politics of the time. 20 years later, the question is, what does it look like? What's the report card for it? Well, in 1994, the European Union was created too, the Maastricht Treaty. So you had kind of two examples of regions of the world that were trying to deal with this concept of the globalization on the horizon. Today, if you look at the European Union economy, it's the largest economy in the world, at $15.79 trillion in 2012. But if you take Canada, the United States, and Mexico, and you combine their three domestic economies, you get an economy that's a little bit bigger, almost $20 trillion. So I think this one statistic indicates that NAFTA really allowed the U.S., by combining with Canada and Mexico and creating a trade bloc, to continue to be competitive with what was happening in Europe. Another statistic is, and there's a lot of them and people kind of talking about, but one I like to look at is what has happened to the GDP per capita of the United States and Mexico. In the last 20 years, the GDP per capita in the United States has grown from $37,000 to about $50,000, about a 34% increase. So the average Joe in America has gotten better off by about 34% since NAFTA was implemented. In Mexico, the improvement for the average Juan has been much greater. GDP per capita at the end of 1993 in Mexico was $4,500, and last year it was close to $12,300. That's an 8-fold increase in the per capita income in Mexico, and that is on top of the Mexican population growing by about 28 million people, or about adding Texas to their country. So the average Mexican citizen has seen a significant improvement in their economic benefit with NAFTA. I was part of the Bush administration for the last 6 years. I also have been involved in setting up the Bush Presidential Library and Museum on the campus of Southern Methodist University. So I feel like I need to take a couple of minutes and talk about what President Bush 43 did as it relates to globalization. He built upon this trade and democracy promotion theme that was started by Reagan and continued by Bush 41 and by President Clinton, his predecessor, and signed and implemented trade agreements with Chile, Costa Rica, Honduras, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Belize, the Dominican Republic, and Peru. He also negotiated and signed deals with Colombia and Panama, but they weren't implemented when he left office. And in 2011, President Obama continued that direction of continued expansion of free trade by implementing the agreements with Panama and Colombia. It has been the cornerstone of our foreign policy strategy in Latin America for at least since Reagan was in office, the expansion of free trade and the promotion of the democratic election, peaceful election of one's leaders. My job when I went to Costa Rica was to help Costa Rica enter the Central American Free Trade Agreement regime. It had been negotiated by President Bush. It had been ratified by Congress in a very close middle-of-the-night vote and had been signed by him, and immediately all of the countries signed up and started implementing the trade agreement except Costa Rica, which for some reason became a little gummed up in the idea that they would accept this kind of written, agreed to offer to join the trade bloc that the United States was expanding in Latin America. And this was a little bit troubling for Washington because no country had ever said no thanks to an open invitation to be part of this trade bloc. When I got to Costa Rica, my job was to get them to enter into it, and things had gotten kind of muddy there. They had been a lot of debate internally about whether this was a good idea for Costa Rica. Trade agreements sound good in theory, but for the people who benefit from the tariffs and the special restrictions on the importation of products, they have a really clean argument as to why these trade agreements are bad, because they're going to lose money, their employees are going to get hurt. Meanwhile, the average guy is really going to benefit because consumer choice, prices of consumer products, things that are kind of generally good for the economy are hard to pinpoint on one particular person. In Costa Rica, we ended up having the world's only, I think, first and only national referendum on a free trade agreement. It got really interesting toward the end of my tenure there because we actually had a national vote. They put up the polling places and they had parades and they had debates. I was out there trying to explain to people this was good for them, good for Costa Ricans. There were people saying this was bad for Costa Ricans. It turned out that the two groups that were most in opposition to Costa Rica joining this trade group were Venezuela and their Cuban partners, because they were creating a alternative trade bloc called ALBA, and most amazingly to me, the U.S. Trade union business. They were big contributors to the campaign to defeat CAFTA in Costa Rica. But at the end of the day, we won by 1 point. It was a very close election, and I came back to Texas, which is my home state. Where do we go from here? Since the crisis in 2008, this concept of kind of expanded globalization and opening up of free markets has actually kind of gone a little bit in reverse. You see regions of the world kind of getting a little more restrictive in how they allow capital goods to flow and how financial products are exchanged. This is kind of predictable because of the crisis that we went through, but it does remind you that free trade and the benefits of it, although they appear to be obvious, are not things that happen naturally. They always have to be promoted and pushed and refined in order for them to be successful. And I think it's important for policymakers to continue to remind people in general that since I was born, about half of the extreme poverty on the planet has been eliminated, primarily because of the expansion of trade and because of the promotion of democracy since the end of World War II. And these are pretty dramatic improvements in the condition of the planet. And as we continue to move forward, I think it's important that we continue to work on those things that have been proven successful in the past to make the world a better place. So with that, I'll pass it on to Tatiana.
Thank you. And I'd like to thank being Nordic for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here, and it's been really fun the whole day. But as an economist, I cannot talk and I'll present you some statistics. So I'm just, I think I'll fit somewhere nicely, complementing Ambassador Landale's talk. He talked about globalization and focused mostly on the trade aspect. So I'm going to take the other side, the finance aspect. So how do countries integrate both trade and finance? So let me show you a few. So let me start. So I think you were talking about all the benefits about the trade agreements and the free trade. And I think especially over the past 2 or 3 years, one of the major debates in Latin America on their loose monetary policy, and what that has meant, that it's creating lots of volatility, exchange rate appreciation, and it's hurting the competitiveness of these countries. And so I'd like to bring to the picture what has been actually the trend over the past, say, 10 years about global finance. What have we seen between Latin America, the US, and the rest of the world, and how has that changed? More of put into the debate of new issues that we may want to consider when we're talking about globalization. And I should have started with this. I'm sorry I have to say this, but it's the standard disclaimer that these are my opinions and not of the bank, its president or managing directors. Sorry about that. So I think a lot of people, when they think about capital flows and when they think about external finance, they talk about net capital flows. That's the current account. But what people perhaps they don't really mention is that what is net capital flows? It's whatever domestic investors are investing outside minus what the foreigners are bringing in. And this is what I'm going to call gross capital flows. And I think that the magnitude of these flows are very different. And if we really want to understand global finance, we need to look at these gross flows. So to give you an example, these two squares that you have there, it's more or less the magnitude of net capital flows for high income and middle income countries. So on average, we're talking about what? 1–2% of GDP since the early 90s until the end of the 2000s. But what about gross capital flows? When you're talking about inflows by foreigners, because the net flows are very low, if you look at inflows by foreigners or outflows by domestic agents, they would be about the same order of magnitude. But this order of magnitude is not about 2% of GDP, it's much higher, and it's actually been increasing a lot over the past decade. So for instance, in the 80s, we're talking about, in high-income countries like the US, we're talking about 5% of GDP. When you go back to the late 2000s, this is about 15% of GDP. So the magnitude of these flows is actually huge if you're thinking about for stability of flows, for the implication for other countries. And if you go and you look at middle-income countries, it's smaller than what you get in high-income countries, but the difference between net and gross, it's also very large. So in the 2000s, the average has been about 6% of GDP of these countries. And I think, so here you have the United States, for example. So the graph on your left is, this is the current account balance. So it's the net capital flows part of the balance of payments. And you're talking about 5% of GDP, and it was rising up until late 2000s. But when you look at gross flows, you're almost, at the same period, you're almost reaching 20% of GDP. And this huge fall, it was exactly the global financial crisis, where flows, there was a huge retrenchment. During the crisis, flows stopped, both inflows and outflows. And after that, I don't have the data, but they eventually picked up and they are back to the pre-crisis level almost. Yeah, we're almost back there. But this is the average country. So you look at these huge flows, we're talking about trillions of dollars. The big question is where these flows go. Are they going to other high-income countries? Are they going to poor countries? Are they going to Latin America? When you look at middle-income countries, same question. Where are these countries investing? Are they just holding treasury, U.S. treasury bonds? Are they actually going to other emerging markets? Are they going to Europe? And I think that's where I want to focus the rest of my 5–10 minutes, is to show you some statistics of where exactly these huge gross positions are actually being invested. And I think I would take the perspective of Latin American countries to change a little bit from the other speakers. So why should we actually care where these flows are coming? I mean, $1 is $1. Whether it's coming from the US or coming from China, it's still $1. So I think first, if you think of Latin American countries or emerging markets as source of funding, so having more markets to invest is actually better because you can actually diversify risk and perhaps get greater returns. As a potential, looking on the other side, as a receiver country, why should I care about having many different sources? I think one of the greatest advantages, you're less vulnerable to shocks to one particular country. So if suddenly the US goes into a crisis, you're less vulnerable to certainly, sometimes a certain drop in flows from the US because you're also getting flows from Europe, China, and other countries. So my question is the composition actually changing given this huge rise in gross capital flows? So is the composition of inflows to Latin American countries changing? Are we getting more flows from the south than to the north, than from the north? And do those investors, are they investing in any different way when they come in? Do investors from the US or investors from Europe or from the emerging world, are they actually investing in the same type of companies, in the same type of business, in the same type of industries more broadly? And how is that related a little bit to trade? Are these flows kind of complementing the trade dynamics, or are they in any way going a completely different direction? So let me start with foreign direct investments. It's very hard to see, but the blue line is the US. So this is FDI inflows from mergers and acquisition into the largest 6 Latin American countries. And you're looking at the composition from countries. So take the first bar, that's 1990. The US was about 60% of these flows. So 60% of the mergers and acquisition, that is foreign direct investment coming to Latin America, was from the US. And you get European countries or other high advanced economies were about 30-35%, and only 5% was coming from the developing world, so other emerging markets. Now, when you look at the last bar on this graph, you're actually looking at 2012, and you see a very different picture. And that year, the US represented less than 20% of these flows to Latin America. European countries represented about the same 20 to 30%, and everything else was coming from the emerging world. So when you look at back in the early 90s to the late 2000s, the composition of these inflows coming to Latin American countries has changed dramatically. When you look at portfolio investment, that's another type of capital flow. So this is equity and bonds investment. So again, the US, the scale, it doesn't go from 0 to 100, it starts at 40. So the US, and this is a big change since 2005. So in 2005, the US was the major investor. It was investing 50% or 55% of the flows to Latin American countries were coming from US investors. You look at 2011, this has fallen to close to 40%. It's a big decline. If you come to think of it, it's 7 years' time. Here, and the top color, the purple part, is the emerging world. You don't see a big increase in volume. So it's the other developed countries are actually compensating for the decline in US investments in Latin America. But while they don't count in terms of volume, or they haven't increased too much in terms of volume, the connectivity of South countries has actually increased. So let me show you a map. So each line in this map means that investment is flowing from one country to another, just among South countries, so just among emerging markets. So this is about portfolio flows, exactly the same graph that I showed you back in 2001, 2002. This is 2003, 2007, and this is 2008, 2011. So while the volume of these flows might not have increased, you see that they got much more connected. You're getting much more diversity of investors in the world economy and markets. So you get all these countries actually coming into the picture as well. So what about the composition? Are capital flows from developed countries very different than that from developing countries? Here we're looking at, again, FDI inflows. The first 3 bars, we're looking at the 2000s on investments from China into Latin America. And what you see is that the vast majority of these investments, and the percentage is kind of wrong, it's on the primary sector. So they're going to commodity firms, be it oil, be it soy, or metal, mining. So it's all on primary. You look on average from the investments from other developing countries, and it also seems to be going more towards primary sector than to manufacturing. However, when you look at the investments from the north, from the developed world, where the US would fit in, you see that it's actually the opposite. Developed countries invest much more in manufacturing industries in Latin America than do the South. So you get a very striking difference. You get the South is rising, but the South is actually investing in a very different type of industries than the North is investing. When you look at greenfield investments, which is the other side of FDI, so these are completely new investments into these countries, the picture is exactly the same. Flows from the South are much more geared towards primary and commodity sectors than flows to the North, that tends to go to the manufacturing sector. And I think probably most of you know, these patterns somehow mirror the trade dynamics of Latin American countries with the rest of the world. Latin American trade with both China and most of the other emerging countries is basically, a good chunk of it is exporting commodities, being agricultural and metal commodities, oil, and importing manufacturing goods. However, our trade with the developed countries is much more balanced in a way. There's a lot more of intra-industry trade in the manufacturing sector, where exports and imports are both through manufacturers, and there's a much smaller share of commodities being shipped to the developed world. So to some extent, the trade and the financial flows are kind of reinforcing each other. They're both, when you deal with the South, Latin American countries are dealing one way. It's about me shipping commodities and exporting manufacturing goods, or me receiving finance so I can probably re-export this same commodities. When I'm trading or when I'm integrating to the North, it's a different dynamic. It's much more about the manufacturing. And so I think this is, I'm bringing this to the table. It's like, what does that mean for the future of Latin America and US relations? Because you're getting this increasing role of South countries that are just dealing with the region in a very different way than the US is dealing. Is that in any way, and I think this is more posing as a question, does that mean that the US is getting increased competition, or it's just they're in different sectors, so it doesn't mean much competition, we're just in different areas? And I think for the region, for Latin America, it's hard to tell which connection is better. I mean, I think in the end, it's the benefits of globalization is whether which one or how it's going to lead to higher convergence, as Ambassador was mentioning in the beginning, about the Mexico growing particularly fast over the past 5 years. So, thank you.
Well, pardon my Carl Levin look, but I'm from Michigan. It's a very popular look. He's a U.S. Senator, for those of you who may not know that. I want to thank Dr. Murphy and Kathleen Murphy for hosting this. It's just been wonderful. I can honestly say that not every one of the speakers have taken a piece of my material respectfully. And I appreciate it. You know, it's one of the things being the last. I don't know. I hope I don't challenge that. Saving the best for the last. Well, I don't know. What would you say? Praise. So thank you again to Steve, too, Dr. Galatas, for inviting me here. It's such an honor to be here with the ambassadors and, of course, with Dr. Tatiana Deidre. Thank you for your comments as well. I've taken good notes in my, while I suspected that I didn't want to be real repetitious, so I thought, well, what can I add to this conversation? And there are a few things that I think very definitely I can pick up on. And one is the relationship between Michigan and Ontario. It's really an example of some things that can happen when you behave like good neighbors and good partners. It's all of the problems are not resolved between Michigan and Ontario. Like they aren't resolved between any two countries or regions or within regions, but we are very dedicated to working on those things, very committed and focused. And one of the things that they say, if you want to see big change, regional partnerships, regional commitment is required, a common agenda. And I think the real difficult part is not only the common agenda, but the common vision. And sometimes, as we've gone through the day, I've thought about that over and over again, that common vision is where we could come together to a great extent. We're just not there. So just as, I'm disappointed that Eduardo isn't here because we've come full circle. He said, if you ask the people what matters to them in Latin America or the U.S. or in Canada, they talk about collaboration that lends to the economy and more jobs. And that's really what we're hearing, and I think that's really the crux of the matter. It goes back to Dr. Murphy likes quotes. And so it goes back to what John Kennedy has said, which I've heard this phrase at every conference that I've ever attended, and I have not heard it here yet. I'm pretty amazed that John Kennedy said geography has made us neighbors, history has made us friends, economics has made us partners, and necessity has made us allies. That still holds true. I even heard the other day Ryan Reynolds, who's an actor, a comedian, he was actually born in Canada, and but is now living in the States, and he said, I like the Great Lakes region, and when they run out of water, I think I'll move back to Canada. It's a matter of necessity. So, with North Dakota, they're experiencing this big boom in their economy because of their energy supply. For the sake of necessity, they're growing jobs like crazy. So I guess, in thinking about that, in some ways, it's not necessary that we work on this relationship, but it's something we want to do, right? We've all benefited from NAFTA and some of the other partnership agreements that we've developed. But what will be the next thing? What will be the hopefully not a Hail Mary pass, right, for our young people? But what will be the next thing? As far as between Michigan and Canada, Dr. Murphy again pointed out, Canada and the U.S. are the largest trading partners in the world. That's good material for creating the value proposition that we can present today on why to work on that relationship. 75% of Canada's exports to the world are to the USA, and then 11% of all Canada's exports to the world are just to Michigan alone. And 277,000 jobs are in Michigan alone, are related to trade with Canada, between Canada and the state of Michigan. So 277,000 jobs. I don't know about you, but in my state, when a company comes in and they create 100 jobs, it's front page news. It's a big deal. That's where we are right now. So 277,000 jobs is not what we want to give up. It's something that we're going to keep working on. And I don't think anyone's moving, are they? Michigan's not going to move. Canada's going to stay its neighbor. And Mexico's not going to move. Latin America is not going to move, right? So we're going to be neighbors. We'll continue to be there. The commitment is worth it, I think, in the long run. So Ontario is more than twice as dependent as Canada on the customers in Michigan. If you take it down even more regionally, 23% of Ontario's exports to the world are to Michigan. So almost a quarter of what happens in Ontario as far as trade goes, it goes to Michigan. 45% of Michigan's exports to the world are to Canada. So half of what happens in Michigan goes to Canada. 37% of that goes only to Ontario. So we're obviously very, very important to one another. I think the same could be said in other regions where the borders are shared between U.S. and Canada and obviously U.S. and Latin America. So some sizable comparisons would happen there. Michigan sells more just to Ontario than to the state's 7 next important customers put together, meaning that Ontario buys more from Michigan than Mexico, China, Germany, Saudi Arabia, Japan, South Korea, and Australia do. So that's huge. You get it, right? This is a relationship worth investing in, worth paying attention to, and worth a commitment. Again, a solid value proposition might be to maintain these exchanges and these numbers, but the real value proposition here is to get even better, go for even more in order to be competitive, globally competitive, like Dr. Is it Deidre? Deidre, thank you. Like she mentioned, actually the ambassador talked about when NAFTA was signed, that was the thing, that was the event that kept us globally competitive at the time. Here we are, needing to really fight, really come together in order to be globally competitive again. So, what will that next move be? One of the things that we share with Michigan between the U.S. and Canada is the shoreline. And I know that's something that is very important to all of us. That shoreline is borders the Great Lakes, which is the largest land, water, natural, or non-salt water resource in the world. And so we share that responsibility. And between Michigan and Canada, 81% of that shoreline is right there. So again, that's a huge responsibility for Ontario and Michigan to take. 81% of that shoreline is right there. And so we feel an immense responsibility for the water. Will it be out of necessity that people go elsewhere? Is that if we don't take care of it, what would that mean to us? So we haven't talked a great deal about environmental impact in that way, but I think that's something that very definitely water sustainability is rising in importance and is really at a critical point now. So we're sort of backtracking and thinking, how do we prevent invasive species? How do we prevent algae bloom? And those kinds of things. In the area of Michigan and Ontario and the Great Lakes region, it's something at the top of our list of things that we need to prioritize and really address. So many times here lately, people have said, well, Anne-Marie, you direct the Canadian Studies Center, and you've been there about 4 or 5 years. We've never heard so much about Canada. All of a sudden, everyone's talking about Canada, and I'm like, I don't think I'm the reason. I think that might be because of the huge increase in trade. In 2009, let's see, I've got some numbers here that I'm not finding, obviously. But the increase is just pretty impressive. In 2009, $40 billion in trade. $40 billion in trade between U.S. and Canada. In 2012, Michigan did $75 billion in trade with Canada. That's huge jump. These are big numbers, and I know you've been hearing them all day, but the significance of them are really astounding. So the other little thing that had something to do with a lot of talk about Canada and the U.S., and particularly in Michigan, is a river crossing. What was first referenced as the Detroit River Crossing, which was the biggest marketing blunder in the history of my life, has become the new international trade crossing between Windsor and Detroit. And why is that? Because it matters not just to Windsor and Detroit. That would be rather naive, wouldn't it, to think that? It matters to the world. But as far as the economy and jobs, it's huge impact to the USA and Canada. That there's a great deal of exchange between Michigan and the U.S. Well, Michigan and Ontario, or the U.S. and Canada, in the auto industry. And it's hard to say anymore where the original product came from, right? So, and I actually had some numbers on that as well, but I don't see it. But they rarely, the auto parts rarely originate from Ontario. They're usually from someplace in the Midwest, and it just goes back and forth. But some people would say, and maybe this is happening here or in some of your states, is that there's competition within regions, and so even within states. So maybe the business attraction effort is working for Grand Rapids, Michigan, but it may not be working right now for Detroit, Michigan. So there's that competition. But when you look at this as far as partnerships go between Canada, the U.S., and Latin America, we want the business attraction to be on our borders or within our borders. We don't want it to be far, far away overseas because of what that can mean to our region, whether it be the Midwest or the Southwest, or it has tremendous impact. So as far as competition goes, in my area of the world, we're really looking at what we can do together on a smaller scale than we're talking about here to attract business in a way that is productive for the entire region, including Canada, Ontario, over to Nova Scotia, Halifax, and down through the Midwest region all the way through to Kentucky. And again, it's the more we grow that, the more attraction, the more business that takes place within those regions, the more the region spreads and broadens. So it's a very, very positive look. So the bottom line really is that how can we move product? How can we do trade more safely, more securely, more rapidly, and aside from more efficiently, I would say more reliably. So when a business says, we'll get that, like Amazon says, we'll get that product to you in 2 days, it better be there in 2 days. And so we have to really come together as the Americas and say, how can we provide that infrastructure, that reliable, safe, secure, speedy, efficient infrastructure that's needed in order to move product, a product that's brought in or product that moves out to the satisfaction of customers. So many of our larger companies now are supply chain companies, really. Amazon, which started out as an online bookstore, if you can believe it, is much, much more than that. They have over 14,000 employees in the U.S., and they hire 50,000 employees on a seasonal basis. And of course, we're all familiar with UPS. UPS in the U.S. has 375,000 employees, and then if you include international employees, it's about 475, nearing 500,000. So these supply chain companies provide jobs. And, going back to my point, they're built around manufacturing. And that's a strength of both, well, I shouldn't say both, I should say all three of our countries, right? So all of these things that we talked today, I said I'd taken good notes, and they sort of come together under a few headlines. One would be business and industry collaboration. So when it would serve as well to talk to these larger companies, Amazon and UPS, and talk about what they need to move their product and how we can make that happen for them. I mentioned asset and infrastructure integration. How can we, the Americas, come together and leverage our strengths and use our resources to the best of our ability to remain globally competitive? One thing that has not come up is workforce talent and education alignment. I so respect what you're doing here today at Stephen F. Austin University and bringing the students here. That's really where it's at, not only in the classroom though, but also with the general public. I know some have mentioned, well, does public opinion really matter? When you've gone through 10 years of working for a bridge, yeah, public opinion does matter, because it can be dissuaded from what's really healthy for the region and for your country and really the quality of life. So I think public opinion really does matter, and I think public education matters even more. So, why don't we have, as three countries that matter so much to us, even when we like it or not, why don't we spend more time in our classrooms, even to the level that sixth grade, when they're fascinated with the world, and talking about just the relationship in the Americas. right now, my kids are fascinated by what's happening in Germany, and when I mentioned this to someone, I believe last night, when I asked my kids, where do you want to live? I thought they were going to say either Louisville, where I'm from, or Michigan, where my husband is from. And one said they wanted to live in Switzerland, and one said they want to live in Germany, and the other one wants to live in Detroit. But I don't know. She wants to say Detroit. So, I want them to stay at least on the same continent as I am. I want to see my grandkids. It's a real issue to think through. So I'm probably about at the end of my time, but I would say that I've also heard today someone say Canada gets forgotten. I think, David, you said Canada gets forgotten. I think Latin America gets forgotten, and I think as well. And I think our relationship just between the Americas gets forgotten, and how valuable it is. And I think we need to revisit that and build some spirit around it. So we talked about policy transformation. We haven't talked about capital access, but I think that's an area where we could leverage some resources to take care of some of these huge projects related to infrastructure and the like. But we didn't talk about the Panama Canal or those things. But I think underlining all of this is the marketing and public education piece. So I'd like to hear what the students think and what some of you think about my comments summarizing what I heard today. And I look forward to it. So thank you.
Thank you very much to the panelists. Let me just ask, are there any, is there more interaction between the panelists before we open it up? Bring it on.
Yes.
Any comments or questions? Yes, Steve.
I've got about 5 or 6 different directions from all of your comments, but I'll limit it maybe to 2 observations. One is, as we know already from earlier comments today, North America is different from the European Union because there's already the deepening of supply chain integration. Now, from the information from the World Bank, that was very fascinating because we see, although U.S. trade, for example, with Latin America is not as significant maybe as certainly the Brazil-EU or Brazil-China relationship, it seems to me that our relationship, where it exists, based on the foreign direct investment information, is deeper. So I'd like each of you maybe to comment about that. And then a secondary comment is, especially to Anne-Marie, is how can the Michigan-Ontario relationship serve as a model, and what are the lessons that in coordinating this huge subnational trade relationship, how can that serve as a model for example, Texas and the border regions here?
That first question.
Okay, I'll go first then. I think you're right on that. I think the FDI presence on the investment side, the U.S. is much, much more present. And I think it has a longer history going back in time than the European Union. But that said, I think there are a few European countries that have a very large presence, and I think Spain is one of them. Especially if you think of finance. Spanish banks are all over the region, whereas U.S. banks, they're starting to come in, and they're up to, I would say, early 2000s, at least in Brazil for sure, they were much more specialized to small clientele, where Spanish banks were for the masses. But I think the U.S. presence is much greater if you think of what companies are there in Latin America. They're mostly American companies. There are very, very few European companies. Even if you think of the retail side, you don't see European brands in Latin America. It's the U.S. presence that is there. So I think the numbers reflect a little bit of there. And then it's the U.S., maybe it's the U.S. trying to get to markets. It's just broader reach of, to get into this large consumer side. Maybe Europeans haven't discovered Latin America yet, but I think you're totally right on your comment that the US is more present there.
I guess two thoughts. First of all, somebody mentioned that the French dreamed up the idea of Latin America, that it really doesn't exist, and I think to some extent that really resonated with me. I mean, Brazil's its own thing. I mean, it's a huge country. I mean, just look at a map, and I mean, it's halfway to Africa if you look at the globe, and it's, you know, size of it. I mean, it really is a self-contained economy. They speak a separate language. They're not that connected to the U.S. market, except for they go to Miami to shop, and they're big enough where they can do that. If you look at kind of Panama North, you're really seeing with Canada the extension of this kind of integrated regional trade platform that I think was envisioned by the last 4 presidents, and it's real. I mean, the supply chain integration in Canada with the automobile industry, or in Mexico with the automobile industry. I think I was reading something in preparing for this that the average product crosses the border 8 times before it's assembled finally into a consumer product like a car. I mean, it's really becoming an integrated production platform, which really makes us competitive globally. On the point about, I might steal a little bit about what Anne Maria was talking about, but for 6 years I chaired the Texas Department of Economic Development, and I was responsible for the relationship with Texas and 5 Mexican border states, and also to grow trade, which was really important for Texas. And this was in the early stages of the implementation of NAFTA. And although marketing and promotion and kind of, you know, entertaining our neighbors was really part of the job, what I ended up realizing is that all of the issues that have to do with really improving the integration of a regional production platform, or deal with border issues, or deal with security, all the issues that really we've been talking about today are federal issues. States do not have the legal authority or ability to negotiate any of those deals. And so states are really relegated to a kind of a cheerleading role to prod and cajole their national representatives to get something done. I wish it was different, but that's just the way our constitutional system's made up. States do not negotiate with or have treaties with foreign countries.
Another good reason for education at a very early level, because we vote for people to represent us. And so if we're well informed on what we would like to see happen, I think that you need to feel empowered by your vote and who you support, and maybe even stepping up and being that leader. So one of the questions she would ask Stephen Moore was what's happening in the Midwest, Ontario region that could be an example for other places. And there are other examples out there of this going on. But I would say we are limited from the difference between state and federal domain. But we have recognized together what our advantages are. For instance, free trade zones. You know, we promote that. We're talking about it more. We're also, as a region, looking at tourism, which is a very, very profitable industry. Would you agree? No one disagrees, so I'm good. Tourism is something that the region agrees on, and we're helping each other make that happen. And that kind of folds into another asset that we have, and that is the environmental asset of the Great Lakes and I would say the environment in general. So I think the leaders of our region have stepped up. The folks in Ohio, and I think this is really an important point, not just policymakers. Actually, it hasn't come from the policymakers as much. It's come from the business sector, right? They're the ones that see the potential for economic growth. And so if their voice is heard by legislators, then it moves into the policy realm. So in Ohio, they have a consortium of business leaders, and they have the same in Michigan, Business Leaders for Michigan. It's a limited group. It's about 80 of the top chief executive officers of the most successful companies that are headquartered in Michigan. So headquartered in Michigan. But that doesn't mean that they don't do business overseas or within the continent, across the continent. So they have a very strong voice. They are very well educated on these issues, much more so than our policymakers. So again, there's this educational push. I haven't mentioned this, but in Michigan we have term limits. And so not only do you have the limitations of state policymakers, you have the limitation of citizen state legislators. So what that means is that we have some of the strictest term limits on our policymakers in the states. For our House representatives, so they come from all districts of the state, there are 81. They're limited to 6 years, serving only 6 years, and then in the Senate, 12 years. And so what you used to know as, some would say a good old boys network, I really don't refer to it as that. It's just that more women leaders are rising to the top these days. But it was a network. They knew each other. They worked they fought well together, and they could come to some agreement in a relatively peaceful way. In Michigan, it's very difficult because you have legislators who are there for a very short time. They're running on one issue. Maybe they care about education, or maybe they have a health care bill they would like to pass. And more recently, they had a bullying bill one of them wanted to pass. So they ran for the legislature, and they won. Okay, so they know nothing about what Mexico means to the U.S. And they know nothing about the ships coming into Halifax and how that product, or in Toronto, Montreal, and how the product flows down through our state and many others, and what value that is to the state. Once an emergency room doctor, there are several small business owners. One owns a print shop. So this education piece really hits hard. I'm sorry to be so repetitive with that, but I think it's critical to our progress that we really teach people and send a strong, united message, if possible, about what our partnership and even our visionary partnership could look like, and what that means to the quality of life across the Americas. I want to say too that our governor has stepped up, and even though he's a state policymaker, he's opened up a trade office in Toronto, and he's traveled there. I've seen him in Toronto speaking to dignitaries and key business owners twice now. So he's a business leader, and understands the value of meeting in person often.
Other questions from anybody? Yes.
A question for Ambassador Lange, but probably more broadly for the panel. You started your presentation with this really interesting comparison between the EU and NAFTA, right, as a kind of a natural experiment running at the same time. It seems to me that there are two very interesting differences about those processes, right? One is the greater integration in terms of a common currency in the European Union, and by now we know that's a bad idea, right? That's clear. But the other great difference, I think, is the greater integration in the European Union in terms of integrating not only the flow of merchandise and capital, but also the labor markets. The creation of common skills, right? Flow of people, and even the integration of skills in terms of integrating the universities, the university system, and training, and so on. Do you think that that would be an important strategy for the next 20 years of NAFTA or not, or to what extent it's feasible?
Well, I think that was part of the theory of NAFTA. Was you start with this North American Free Trade Agreement, which reduces tariff barriers and starts introducing some common regulations. But it's a process. President Bush 43 set up a couple of committees. One was called the North American Competitiveness Council, and the other one was called the Security and Prosperity Partnership. They were launched in Cancun, and they had 30 members, and they had very specific tasks to further down the path the integration that you're talking about. Unfortunately, with the financial crisis and President Obama, once again remembering that the natural constituency of the Democratic Party, which is trade unions, are really opposed to these free trade agreements. They think they're existential threats to them, and so these committees that they were disbanded by President Obama and have been recreated. But I think the EU was a step further. I mean, the border crossings in the EU, you don't need passports and things like that. When you get to economic disparities like you see between the United States and Mexico and into Central America, it becomes almost a bridge too far to go do what the EU did. And if you look at the EU debates, it was a real stretch for them to take in Spain and Portugal, which were really the poor neighbors. I mean, people forget how poor Spain and Portugal were in the early 90s. But you compare that to Mexico and Texas, or Mexico and the United States. It's on a scale. I mean, the southern half of Mexico is still extremely impoverished, and so the idea of an open border between Mexico and the United States, I think, is politically a non-starter. But the concept where you really do allow this freer exchange of goods without friction is still a good one. Common currency, not so much. Yeah.
We have about 10, 15 minutes left for questions. I should mention that Dr. Didier has to leave at 5, so if you have a question for her, she has a claim to understand. Yes, sir.
I have a question for all three. It relates to, finally, the question of infrastructure came up, and Anne-Marie mentioned the New Detroit River, the bridge, which is really important, and Panama Canal came up, and the work that's going on in the Panama Canal. But when you look at the need for the bridge in Detroit, which would never have happened unless we had free trade, which you brought up, Ambassador, which is really important. And we see that with other countries. But we're talking about the relationship of Latin America and North America, and I think, can we talk about what Panama Canal, especially Panama Canal, may do? What expansion of infrastructure in various countries in the hemisphere? For example, real good roads in southern Mexico, what could that do for poverty in that part of Central America? And also the investment that's necessary from all over to get this kind of stuff done. So, over to you.
Wow. It's big. Well, I guess a couple of thoughts come to mind. One of them is that you have to be careful about the strum and drung and anxiety of the issue of the moment, because I remember everybody pulling their hair out over the Panama Canal being turned over to the Panamanians, and if you look in hindsight, that was such a no-brainer and a great thing for everybody. And the expansion of the Panama Canal is a wonderful addition to global trade. It's going to probably do more for the Gulf Coast of Gulf of Mexico ports and Charleston, and than maybe the rest of Latin America. But it's a big deal for global trade for sure. These infrastructure issues are tough. They're expensive. It's unfortunate about the bridges. I can't remember who was complaining about the bridge to, I guess I was talking to Paula about we can't come up with $250 million of a $4 billion joint infrastructure project with Canada and it's kind of sad, but it's all kind of gummed up in the transportation bill and our own internal politics, and it's just the way it is right now. Money's tight. You wish that politics could be rational, but they're not.
Yes.
Yeah, I want to follow a little bit with what the ambassador just said about comparing the European Union with North America and Latin America. As you said, North America is rich, Latin America is poor, or there are big pockets of poverty in Latin America. So I wonder, thinking about the title of the conference, the future of the relationship, is really, and I think the case of Michigan and Ontario seem to be the exception rather than the norm in these trade agreements. Is the way we have conceptualized this free trade gonna work in the future? Should we change the concepts and the ideas to make sure to think about that future of the relationship, that Latin America or these big pockets of poverty in Latin America disappear, and we can have something similar to what's happening in the European Union? And you mentioned the case of Spain and Portugal. So is there something that needs to be changed? Because it seems to me that the system is not really working for a lot of people.
Well, I'm going to say something controversial here, but I guess Dean Murphy asked me to do that when I asked him what he wanted me to do. So, but this is just from my personal experience. I've been going to Mexico since I was 12 years old. I lived there when I was 15 to 17. I've traveled all throughout southern Mexico. I was ambassador in Costa Rica. I've been, I've actually, slept in and lived with the poverty that people talk about. And these are people just like anybody else, but it's given me an appreciation, I'm just talking anecdotally here, about what it means to do better. And I think Americans in particular, because we are so rich, we have a per capita income of approaching $50,000, that we look at people that have $12,000 and we go, oh my God, they're pathetic, they're so poor. Well, when I was born, half the world lived on less than $1 a day. We're talking extreme poverty. It's hard to even get your head around it. You can go to, just in Africa last summer, and you can go to some parts of Africa and you kind of start to see it, or you can maybe get in deep South Chiapas or Nicaragua. Definitely these countries that have reverted to these totalitarian models are poster children for that kind of poverty. But when trade, really what happened since 1950, when there's this kind of consensus because of the global wars and everything that kind of global trade and democracies really were kind of the organizing model that created a greater world. They really worked. And there's a Danish economist named Bjorn Lomborg who writes about this, but about half of the people that were living in extreme poverty on the planet have gotten out of it. And that's a pretty big deal. And maybe that means they live on $10 a day or $20 a day, but for them, it's a new world. And so I think we have to adjust our lens of the measurement of success, because it's a long haul, and you want to allow everybody to kind of have some hope. The thing about Mexico that is amazing to me in the 20 years since NAFTA is the sense of hope that Mexicans have for their own country. And that didn't exist when I first started doing business down there 25 years ago. They were coming here, and they didn't really think there was a future for them in their home country. But Mexicans now go home and they want to start a business there. They don't really want to be in the United States anymore. And it's just like a complete reversal. And I think it's the success of NAFTA and the example of having some success, going from $4,000 to $12,000 on average. You take Carlos Slim out of the equation, it's maybe more like $10,000, but still it's it's a big improvement. But the trajectory is in the right direction, and the engines that have made that trajectory work are really trade and the other twin pillar, which is this concept of democratic election of your leaders. In Mexico, we have seen the opposition party voluntarily turn power over to the other party twice, 2000 and just recently. that didn't happen like for 100 years in Mexico. And that ability for a person to elect their leader, like one of the speakers earlier was talking about these indigenous Indians in Peru who are angry because their environmental condition is being harmed. It made me think of China, where there's 200 revolts a day in China, primarily from the rural areas where people are, they can't farm their land because it's been destroyed by pollution, or their land has been seized by some local guy, and they can't redress their grievances through any sort of democratic process, and it's suppressed. And that's not the long-term solution, but what's been going on in Latin America for the most part, Nicaragua, big exception, Cuba, big exception, Venezuela, big exception, but for the most part, that whole region in my lifetime has been a tremendous success, and I think it's continuing in the right direction.
And if I may,
Yeah.
I was going to say, I think one of the big changes in Latin America, especially since the early 90s, is the macro stability. Now, you think of the big countries in the region, they all have the macro right to some extent. So up to, say, mid-90s, 95 or so, countries, they couldn't really think about long-run growth because they have to deal with crisis after crisis, being political, being economic, it was just crisis after crisis, so you're always in crisis mode. Once you started the reforms in the early 90s after all the dictatorships, things have stabilized. You don't have the problem of hyperinflation anymore. The political, as you said, democracies are kind of more established. You get central banks are independent. You get inflation targets systems in a number of countries. Now I think that's the time where the region can actually think about longer run growth and where the catch-up may actually come. So I think now the question of poverty becomes much more important. And I think if you look back of the last 5 to 10 years, I think inequality in the region has declined a lot. You got a number of people, as you're saying, a great number in the world has crossed the $1 a day. I think that's definitely true for Latin America, where you get this huge move from actually the poor becoming lower middle class. And it's the region, I think, and especially the US, I think it's a great opportunity because you get this great number of consumers coming in, and I think it's a new word that the region is evolving slowly. It's a process that goes slowly. It's not from day to night, but I think we're getting there eventually.
I think we're just about at the point where we'll let Dr. Murphy wrap the conference up here.
Does anybody have a last question?
Last burning question out there.
Great, let's thank